next speaker is a Melburnian. Woo! Via the UK. He is Associate Professor in French Studies at Monash University in Melbourne, Dr. Christopher Watkin. His specialty is the history of European thought, really, intellectual history. And he's written fabulous books on the impenetrable thinkers, like Foucault and Derrida. You know, the sort of people where, when they're mentioned, you go, you have no idea what those guys thought. This is a man who writes books on such people. His new book is Biblical Critical Theory, and if you've seen any of the recommendations of the book, you'll know that it is an astonishing accomplishment. 672 pages of clarity and insight. But if you want the 1 hour version, episode 80, I think, of Undeceptions, we had him for ourselves. We're going to have a Q&A after he speaks, but for now, please welcome Dr. Christopher Watkin.
I'd like to begin, if I could, with a thought experiment. Please take the person next to you, not literally, of course, don't manhandle the person next to you. Leave them right where they are. But please consider, please contemplate the person next to you. And please imagine that that person has become captured by some terrible conspiracy theory. And it is your job to try and disabuse them of this terrible ideology that's captured them. Now, you might begin something like this. Please let me assure you that the Prime Minister is not a giant toad from the planet Flim-Flam, whatever else you may have been told. You think you've made quite a convincing point. But your neighbour, to your horror, replies to you, "I was told to expect people like you. You're one of them. You are a conspiracy denier. I feel sorry for you. You've got no idea what's going on in the world." Slightly put on the back foot, you try a different tack, and you work through your repertoire of different ways of trying to convince this person that they're prey to a conspiracy theory. And as time goes on, it gradually dawns on you that nothing is getting through. You cannot tell this person anything that they don't already have a way of fitting within their conspiracy view of the world. You can't shake them. You can't disengage them from this ideology that's captured them. Now, I wonder if I might make this illustration just a little bit more uncomfortable. Imagine that the shoe is on the other foot, and you're the one who's been captured by this bizarre conspiracy theory, and it's your neighbour's job to try and convince you that you're wrong. Well, you might say, just wait a minute, stop right there. Now, it is clear that in this illustration, I'm supposed to be the person who's got everything right. I'm supposed to be the person who sees clearly, not the person who needs disabusing of the conspiracy theory. In fact, I'm quite offended that you would put me in the position of the one who needs arguing out of the way that they see the world. Thank you very much. Now, you have just thought your way into the life and work of an early 20th century German Marxist playwright, which I suspect of all the things you thought you might be doing when you woke up this morning was not high on your list. Your name is Bertolt Brecht, and you're living in the Germany of the 1920s and 30s. And you see a comfort in the society around you with a growing militarism and nationalism and warmongering spirit. And it worries you that that seems okay to people, that they don't realize how horrible war is, that they've been captured by this ideology that seems to think that war is a good thing, that we should beckon on. They don't realize that war hurts the weakest people most and destroys families and destroys nations. And you want to try and convince the people around you that this is the case. But there have been lots of depictions in the past of the horrors of war, and they're just not getting through. And the reason is that people are so passionately engaged with the ideology that they hold that there's no room for the truth, for the reality of war to have any purchase upon them. And so you helped to develop something that came to be called epic theatre. You'll know when we usually go to the theatre, it happens a bit like this, doesn't it? The lights go down, the actors come on the stage, and for an hour or two, you forget the real world, you lose yourself in the story, and then at the end the lights come up, and you're back in the real world. Well, Brecht didn't want that. He didn't actually turn the lights down in his theatre, he turned them up when the action started, because he didn't want people to forget the real world. He wanted them to think about what they were seeing, to see themselves seeing, if you like, and he wanted to try and disengage them from these ideologies that were capturing them. And so he instructed his actors, don't inhabit your roles, quote your lines, make it obvious that you're acting. So I don't want the audience to be lulled into this nice storytelling false sense of security. I don't want them to lose themselves in the story. I want them to see themselves seeing, and therefore to think about what they're seeing, to think about how they're interpreting. And he'd have actors come across the stage carrying placards, telling people what was going on. Actors would break the fourth wall and address the audience once in a while. He was trying to smash our view of the way that we customarily see the world and to open us up to the possibility that something else might be going on. And of course, Brecht wasn't the first person ever to do something like this, ever to try and disengage people from their nice, cozy ways of seeing the world in order to introduce them to a reality that their ideology was blinding them from. It's a technique that we see throughout the Bible, in fact. We see it in that nice little story with a sting in the tail that the prophet Nathan tells to King David about the rich man who kills the poor man's little lamb in order to have a feast. And then David says, how dare this rich man do that? And then Nathan turns and says, it's you. You did that. David is horrified. It's a technique we see in the book of Joel, where Joel tries to show people the terrible devastation that an invading army brings by talking about that army as a plague of locusts sweeping through the land. And it's a technique that we often see in Jesus' parables as well. He tells sort of normal, everyday situations, but there's something uncanny, there's something not quite right about them. Someone doesn't behave as you'd expect them to behave, and it just knocks us out of our cozy ways of understanding the world. But perhaps the most vivid and sustained example of this in the whole Bible is to be found in the book of Revelation. Now, it is a bit of a tragedy, isn't it, that when Christians customarily come to the book of Revelation, our understanding of it is often dominated by what is the precise sequence of events leading up to the end times. And that's a tragedy, because the book of Revelation is one of the most sustained and powerful exercises in ideology critique in the whole of the Bible. And something that is incredibly valuable for us, actually, whether we're Christians or not, in coming to terms with how we live in this late modern world that we all inhabit. The title of the book, Revelation, Apocalypsis in Greek, means an unveiling. So what Revelation is trying to do as a book is to pull the wool off from over our eyes, to unveil us from the ideologies that have captured us, and to help us to see reality as it really is, to see the truth of the world in which we live and not to live a lie. And one of the most powerful ways that the book of Revelation does this in its central chapters is by contrasting two cities. On the one hand, you've got the city of Babylon, and on the other hand, you've got the city of the New Jerusalem. And I just want to spend a few minutes thinking through with you how Revelation presents both of those cities and to draw some lessons for how we live today and how we make sense of society in our own day. Let's take Babylon to begin with. It's pretty clear in the book of Revelation that Babylon is referencing the city of Rome. So, for example, it's built on 7 hills, and Rome is on 7 hills as well. And the goods that Babylon trades in are very similar to the goods that the Roman Empire traded in. So there's a reference to Rome. But it's also pretty clear that Babylon is more than Rome. There are echoes of the way that the Bible talks about Babel in Babylon, and Sodom and Tyre and Edom and other cities. And so the sense we get is that Babylon is an amalgam of all the godless cities and cultures that there have been. It's what Augustine in The City of God calls the earthly city, the sum of all culture without reference to God. And the way that Babylon is passed out in these central chapters of Revelation is largely through 2 figures who rule this city. You've got the prostitute and you've got the beast from the sea. And in one of the most helpful books that I've read on Revelation by a scholar called Richard Borkham, he looks at all the references to the prostitute and all the references to the beast. And he shows how the prostitute seems to be a symbol of economic domination, and the beast seems to be a symbol of military and state domination. So these are the 2 arms of this Babylonian empire. It dominates you economically and it dominates you militarily and politically as well. So let's look at the prostitute and then we'll look at the beast in a moment. The economic domination of Babylon goes something like this. We will flood your economy with our goods and will make you financially dependent upon us, such that not only is your economy made into something that feeds us, but actually your culture is dominated as well. There's a cultural aspect to this economic domination. And we might think it odd, do you think it odd, that economic domination is pictured by the figure of a prostitute? Why choose that figure in Revelation? I reckon that the fact that we ask that question says a great deal more about us, actually, than it does about the Bible. Because we tend, and by we I mean sort of late modern Western people, tend to separate something that the Bible almost always holds together. You think about those lists of sins in the New Testament, in Paul's letters and so forth. Very, very often, you will get financial rapacity, greed, and sexual licentiousness, sexual immorality, right up against each other, side by side. Greed and sexual immorality walk hand in hand in the Bible. But we, in our political landscape, have seen fit to separate them, haven't we? So those who are broadly inclined toward a left-wing view of things today will say that we must be controlled and responsible in our use of money. We must redistribute money so that the poorest in society have enough. But don't tell me what to do with my body. I can do whatever I want with my body. And others who are more inclined towards a right-wing view of things will say that we must be controlled and responsible with the use of our bodies. No, don't sleep around. But don't tell me what to do with my money. Don't tell me I need to pay more tax. Don't tell me I need to give it away. And we've separated financial morality from sexual morality. And in that, we've gone against the Bible, because it doesn't. And therefore, in the biblical way of thinking, it's quite natural to represent financial promiscuity, financial rapacity, in the figure of the prostitute. Let's have a little look at the beast. The beast is this symbol of military and state power. Now, when we use the word power, it can be quite a positive thing, isn't it? Power can be used well. The idea of power here is very much not that. The power of Babylon, as it's presented in the book of Revelation, is a brutal, dominating, exploiting power. And in many ways, the power that it's referring to has its epitome in the institution of crucifixion. Think about what a crucifixion is. Think about it from the Roman point of view. Just factor out Christ's crucifixion for a moment. Just think about crucifixion as an institution within Roman society. What is it doing? Well, it's a publicity campaign, isn't it? People were crucified in public. Why? Because the Romans were using the dying howls and wails and moans and gasps of these people as an advertising slogan. If you cross us, we will do this to you. It is instrumentalizing and commodifying the death of these people in order to send a message about Rome. It is utter domination, isn't it? We will even use your death to make our message. That is how powerful we are. Do not think that you can cross us. And that is the sort of power that we're talking about in relation to Babylon with this beast. And the way of being in the world that's characteristic of this Babylonian empire in the book of Revelation is summed up by the idea of mastery. We will master you. We will dominate you. We'll dominate you economically. We'll dominate you militarily. And we will dominate you politically, so don't you dare stand up against us. Let me just read you a little passage. The way that Revelation does this is brilliant. Revelation 18, and I'm just going to read verses 11 to 13. It's talking about the different goods that Babylon trades in. Let's listen to this little passage. The merchants of the earth will weep and mourn over her, over Babylon, because no one buys their cargoes anymore. Cargoes of gold and silver, precious stones and pearls, fine linen, purple silk, scarlet cloth, every sort of citron wood, articles of every kind made of ivory, costly wood, bronze, iron, and marble. Sounds lovely, doesn't it? Do you want to go on a holiday somewhere like that? I mean, it's wonderful. So it's a rich cornucopia of different goods that are on sale. Cargoes of cinnamon and spice, of incense, myrrh and frankincense, of wine and olive oil, of fine flour and wheat, cattle and sheep. Take my money, take me to that restaurant. I want to eat here. This sounds a wonderful thing, isn't it? Horses and carriages and human beings sold as slaves. Ouch. Do you see how the writer there is just lulling us into this false sense of security? It's wonderful. There's a richness about this Babylonian society. It's beautiful. And it is incredibly vicious and ugly as well. And that, in a sense, is this Brechtian moment, isn't it? Isn't this a wonderful society in which we live? We're all here with our phones, and we've got the tea upstairs, and there's lunch here, and it's a beautiful church, and we've flown our keynotes in from the States, and everything's great, and there's a wonderful city outside, and it's a world city, and the World Cup's on at the moment, and quite a few of the clothes that we're wearing were made in sweatshops by children. It's that gut punch, isn't it, that the writer of Revelation is trying to get over to us. And I think the way that Revelation is trying to work on us is to throw this symbolism at us of the prostitute and the beast as a way to disengage us from the way that we customarily see the world. And therefore, we shouldn't try to brush past this symbolism and to sort of decode it. It's sometimes our way of reading books like Revelation is, what does it really mean? Who is the prostitute really? Who is the beast really? And then once we've found it, we think we can leave that symbolism behind and deal with the pure, abstract nouns of military power and whatever. But if we try and read it that way, we're completely missing what Revelation is trying to do with us. It's like taking that sonnet of Shakespeare's, that "Shall I compare thee to a summer's day?" and saying, what does he really mean? Well, he really means, I love you. Well, William, why don't you just say that? Honestly, summer's day, goodness me. Just say that it's not the point, is it? I love you does not convey the same experience as shall I compare thee to a summer's day. The essence of it is lost if you try and reduce it to that other language. And similarly, when we read the book of Revelation, I think we need to press into the symbolism, not try and get past it to what it really means, because then we're losing this power of ideology critique. And I think this pushes back against a particular way that Christians often think about cultural engagement, about how the gospel relates to the culture. And I think there's a risk that sometimes we think of cultural engagement like this, that the culture is quietly sitting, checking its phone over in the corner there, just like John, waiting. Waiting to be called over. And then once in a while, we sort of beckon the culture over and we ask it some questions and it replies politely to us, and then it goes back and sits in its corner and doesn't bother us again. That's not the picture of cultural engagement in the book of Revelation. The picture of cultural engagement in the book of Revelation is something more like this. You wake up in the morning and you find that the prostitute is in your bed, and the beast is driving away down the street with your computer and your television in the back of its van. The problem is that we're all too engaged with culture. That we're like that person in that original illustration of the conspiracy theory. We need to disengage. So our view of the beast is that little beastie-weastie, nice little fluffy thing over there, gorgeous. And our view of the prostitute is that lovely lady that people say those nasty things about. How dare they? We need to disengage from the culture in order to be able to see things as they really are. And that's what this language of Revelation is trying to do for us. Wake up. Pull the wool from over your eyes. Apocalypsis. Unveiling. Disengage from the culture. Please, is begging the book of Revelation to us. And if that was all that the book of Revelation was doing, then it would take its place alongside all the different critiques of society that have been made over the past 2,000 years or so. Many of them armchair critiques, finger-wagging critiques. But wonderfully and gloriously, that isn't all that the book of Revelation does. Because as well as trying to pull the veil from across our eyes so that we can see the world in which we live clearly, Revelation also presents to us a beautifully, deliciously beguiling picture of a different way of living. A picture that shows us that Babylon isn't the entirety of reality. Babylon need not fill our whole horizon. There's a different way of being in this world. There's a different city to belong to. And this is Revelation's picture of the New Jerusalem. Now, if you look at everything that the Bible says about the New Jerusalem and everything that it says about Babylon, you'll find that it's almost a point-by-point negation of everything Babylon stands for. So, whereas Babylon has the prostitute, the New Jerusalem has the chaste bride of Christ. Whereas Babylon has all the riches that it's amassed by exploitation and domination, the New Jerusalem has the splendor and glory of God. Whereas Babylon has the wine that makes the nations drunk, the New Jerusalem has the water of life flowing through it. Whereas Revelation very poignantly, I think, says for our society, for the citizens of Babylon there is no rest. God gives rest to the citizens of the New Jerusalem. And to use Richard Baucham's language again, whereas he says that the city of Babylon has a globalization of domination, the New Jerusalem has a globalization of blessing. Now, of course, there is a systematic contrast between these two cities, but it's not that Jerusalem is reacting to Babylon. It's precisely the other way around, isn't it? The devil has no fresh, new ideas. Babylon is a parody of Jerusalem, as sin is always a parody, a perversion of truth. Babylon is a mockery of the New Jerusalem. That's the way around that it works. But there's one feature of the New Jerusalem that is not a direct contrast, not a direct equivalent of something in Babylon. It's really interesting, and Baucham expands this, and I just want to share it with you because I was really struck by it when I saw it. He says that, whereas Babylon has these figures of the prostitute and the beast, that there's no equivalent figure roaming the earth for the New Jerusalem. In fact, Revelation is really circumspect about the way that it talks about God's power. So it will talk, for example, of a voice coming from the throne rather than from God. It uses oblique language. And Baucham says the reason for that is that Revelation wants to make it really clear to us that God is not just the most powerful king. He's not beastier than the beast, the biggest beast. That's not God. His power is of a completely different nature. And therefore, his power can't be co-opted by any earthly group or individual. Between Christ's ascension and Christ's return, there is no one on earth who embodies God's power in a totalizing way. And that is a warning shot across the bows of some flavors of Christianity today that would seek precisely to establish that sort of power in our age. Now, whereas the inhabitants of Babylon are characterized by this spirit, this disposition of mastery, the inhabitants of the New Jerusalem are not masters, they're martyrs. Again and again, this image of martyrdom comes up in Revelation. I just want to dispel two misunderstandings about martyrdom before we go on to examine it in more detail. The first one, I think, is a legacy of what's happened in our culture since 2001, which is that we often now identify martyrdom with violence, with suicide bombers or whatever. Well, that couldn't be further from the truth of what Revelation is talking about. There is sometimes violence involved in martyrdom, but it is always violence done to the martyr. It is never violence perpetrated by the martyr. Revelation's picture of martyrdom is not violent. The second misunderstanding is that I think we often associate martyrdom with death. The way to be a martyr is to die for one's belief. But the concept is much wider than that. The word comes from the Greek for witness. And so a martyr is one who witnesses. Now, of course, one can witness through the way that one dies. If one is put to death for what one believes, then that is a way of witnessing. But that is not the full extent of what it means to witness. And so we can reappropriate perhaps those words of St. Francis of Assisi and say, witness at all times, use death if necessary. Death is not all there is to witness. And this picture of the martyr, I think, captures what I've been trying to talk about in different ways throughout the whole of this talk, which is that there's a dynamic of disengagement from the culture and a dynamic of engagement with the culture. Let me just explain what I mean by that. You can't witness to someone, and this is the disengagement, unless you've got something to tell them they don't already know. If all I'm doing is echoing back to the culture what the culture already knows perfectly well, thank you very much, then I'm not witnessing to it. I'm just a sounding board. And that is perhaps the danger of some of the cultural engagement that Christians propound today. We're not telling people anything other than what they're already perfectly aware of. But similarly, there can't be witnessing unless there's a certain engagement. I can't witness in a room by myself with the door shut and nobody listening. I have to speak in a way that people can understand. I have to some extent to get my message across in order to have witnessed. There has to be an engagement. And perhaps that's a lesson that other branches of Christian cultural engagement might need to hear today. Not simply denouncing from afar and never actually making contact with anyone in the culture. So, this double dynamic of disengagement and engagement. Let me, in the final few minutes that I've got, share with you one of my favorite passages from the Bible, because I think it's another instance outside the book of Revelation of where this double dynamic happens brilliantly. And I think it's one of the passages that gives us the richest and most healthy blueprints for how, as Christians, to think about society, to make social sense of Christianity today. It's 1 Corinthians chapter 1. And I'm going to start reading just a little passage beginning in verse 20. 1 Corinthians 1, verse 20. The Apostle Paul is writing to a bunch of Christians in Corinth, and he says, "Where is the wise person? Where is the teacher of the law? Where is the philosopher of this age? Has God not made foolish the wisdom of the world? For since in the wisdom of God, the world through its wisdom did not know him, God was pleased through the foolishness of what was preached to save those who believe. Jews demand signs, and Greeks look for wisdom. But we preach Christ crucified, a stumbling block to Jews and foolishness to Gentiles. But to those God has called, both Jews and Greeks, Christ the power of God and the wisdom of God. For the foolishness of God is wiser than human wisdom, and the weakness of God is stronger than human strength." Paul is doing two things in this passage, and it is the combination of those things that is dynamite and sets this pattern for cultural engagement, I believe. The first thing that he's doing is he's showing that there's clear blue water between his gospel message and what the culture thinks it wants. There's an antithesis. They're like chalk and cheese to each other. So he identifies these dominant cultural values in the world around him. He says, you Greeks, when you get up in the morning and you look at yourself in the mirror, you want to see someone who's wise. That's how you know you've arrived. That's your peak value. You want to be known as wise. And you Jews over here, you want to seek miraculous signs, which later on in the passage it's clear what they're seeking there is power in those signs, a demonstration of God's power. Well, he says, I've got bad news for you. You Greeks want wisdom. I come with a message of foolishness. It's not going to be what you think you're after. Massive moment of disengagement from the culture. This is not what you think you need. And if that was all that Paul said, those Christians who think that cultural engagement is all about denouncing the culture and calling out its sins would be cheering from the stands, saying, Paul, he's our guy. You sock it to them, Paul. You tell them their culture's rubbish. But of course, that isn't all that Paul says in that passage, is it? Because he also says, a couple of short verses later, that the foolishness of God is wiser than human wisdom. And so what is he doing at that point? It's as if he's got this sort of wisdom scale in front of him. And he takes Greek wisdom and he says, where does it fit on this wisdom scale? Oh, just close to the bottom, I'm afraid. Dear Greeks, you keep bouncing from one philosophical school to the other and you're never quite sure whether you found wisdom or not, and you always want to hear the next speaker. It's not sort of peak wisdom, is it, really? And then he takes God's foolishness. He says, where does that fit on the scale? It fits right at the top. And at that point, it's as if he is issuing a challenge to these Greeks. He says, I know this is going to sound ridiculous. Hear me out. Are you serious about searching for wisdom? Really serious? Because if you are, let me challenge you in this way. Are you willing to search for this wisdom that you prize so much in the place where you would least think you would ever find it, which is in a man dying on a cross in agony, the most foolish thing in the world to you? Are you willing to search for it there? Because if you do, let me promise you this, you will find in the foolishness of the cross a wisdom of a richness and a depth and a fullness that you've never even imagined. You've got to be willing to search for it at the cross, though. You've got to turn around. You've got to repent. You've got to leave behind all your ideas of what wisdom must look like if it's out there somewhere, and humble yourself to search for it in the midst of the foolish cross. And so what is Paul doing in this passage? Is he disengaging from culture? Massively he is. You want wisdom? I'm bringing you foolishness. You want strength? Sorry, I'm bringing you weakness. He's not simply trying to get alongside the culture and say, what you want is great, and I'm just going to show you how you can have that thing in Jesus with, a little cherry on the top. It's basically, you don't need to change anything. Just continue as you are and add Jesus to it and you'll be good. No, absolutely not. Massive disengagement. But is Paul engaging in this passage? Yes, massively he is. Because he says, you want wisdom? Seriously, look me in the eye. Tell me, is that what you really want? Let me show you where you can find its fullness. He's bringing the culture to its fulfillment, isn't he? Saying, this is what you have always wanted, without realizing it. Please, please be humble enough to search for it here. Massive cultural engagement. And this is my final sentence. This is the pattern that therefore I want to commend to those of us who are Christians here, of engaging with our culture. Disengagement and engagement go hand in hand. And if there are some of us here who are not Christians, then I guess I will just let Paul's appeal stand as it is. Are you serious about searching for what you really want? Because the challenge is, if you look for it in the place where you think you'd least be likely to find it, you might just be surprised. And when we do this, I think one of the things that we'll find is that rather than as Christians explaining the Bible to the culture, we will also find that we're explaining the culture to itself in the language of the Bible. Thank you.